happening, and why Rakia was screaming. And there were 3 men, Kadi had said again, tight-lipped. Cyrus had said, "And did the nurse, Rakia, know who they were?" Kadi had shaken her head. "They caught and blindfolded her before... Then did the 3 men see you?" Cyrus asked. Kadi had only shrugged, saying, "Right away Rakia and Laraba hid me, and by night the arrangements had all been made to smuggle me out of Ubangiba." Now Kadi had announced that she had to go back in response to Sammy's call for help. In April, on their brief visit to that country with Carstairs, she'd been safe enough. She'd been warmly welcomed by old friends. But she'd been well protected on that trip. Since then, knowing more, both Mrs. Pollifax and Cyrus had wondered if those 3 men had survived the brutal reign of President Simoko that had followed the coup. And, if they were still alive, what might happen when Kadi returned again? Would they fear being recognized and identified by Kadi, and find it expedient to silence her? Cyrus interrupted her troubled thoughts to say, "Mrs. Lupacek." Jolted, Mrs. Pollifax said, "What? Who?" "Mrs. Lupacek. Here last month when you had the flu. She could move in, take over." "But did you like her, Cyrus? You have to remember I had that horrendous temperature," she reminded him. "I was upstairs in bed, and you were in the living room, in the hospital bed, and I scarcely remember anything." Cyrus sighed. "Lightning certainly struck twice. Mrs. Lupacek, strong as an ox. Puts things where I can't find 'em, but likable. I could manage. Professional nurse, too, after all. Good cook. And frankly, my dear, a vacation would do you a world of good. You've lost weight. You're still pale and not at all up to snuff. Between the flu and waiting on me, you've tired yourself out." "A vacation," thought Mrs. Pollifax with amusement, "when Samat is in trouble and has sent out an SOS to Kadi for support and help?" A troubled African country, Ubangiba, she reflected, small and impoverished. Kadi had grown up there with Samat, who happened to be the grandson of King Zamat VIII. He had been sent as a boy to her father's mission school to study and be trained for college abroad. In those days, it hadn't been an impoverished country. It was after the king's death that Ubangiba had been looted and despoiled by coups and atrocities. Samat's father was the first leader to be assassinated. He had been succeeded by President for Life Chinyata, who had done his best to bankrupt the country until he in turn was assassinated in the coup by President for Life Simoko. It was during this period that Samat had been sent off to Yale University, apparently placed on hold by Simoko's government for some future use, when his royal lineage might be exploited or his death adroitly arranged. His future use had become apparent in April, when President for Life Simoko had been assassinated. It was from Yale that Samat had been rescued by Carstairs, with the help of Kadi and Mrs. Pollifax. And during the 3 days they had all spent in Ubangiba, and even before their departure, the chiefs of the Shambi and Soto tribes had pleaded with Samat to become mfumo, or chieftain, and restore heart to the devastated country. He might be young, but he was, after all, the grandson of their beloved King Zamat, and it was Samat who possessed the sacred royal ring of gold, and who had studied abroad such important matters as economics and African agriculture, and many other subjects that they hoped might bring a few miracles. From what they'd learned since April, it appeared that Samat had indeed been producing a few miracles. Inflation had fallen. The guar was now worth 30 cents to the US dollar, and he had persuaded the Shambi and the Soto tribes to select representatives to write a constitution that included human rights and elections in 3 years. Except